From the Hollywood Hills to the halls of the White House, Kalpen Suresh Modi, better known as Kalpen to all of us, has had quite an exciting and diverse career. He's actually done the unthinkable many years ago. He took a break from his LA life and his Hollywood life to do something completely different, and that was public service. He was part of President Obama's White House, and then he went back to his acting career, and now he serves on the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities, which is an advisory body and something which we will ask Kalpen about shortly. But Kalpen, welcome to India.
Thank you.
Your home country, as it were. It's interesting that you've come here at this time because you've been so involved in American politics yourself, and we're in the middle of this unbelievable US campaign which is making headlines in India every single day. Did you ever imagine we'd be sitting here and talking about nominee Donald Trump?
First of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's nice to be back in Delhi. No, I didn't anticipate that I would ever be here talking about the current sort of spread of the election period, but it's a very interesting time in the U.S. and you know, we're always curious about how it's covered abroad. So having the chance to spend a few weeks in India, and I was in Canada before that, it's interesting to see how much interest there is.
Were you surprised at the level of
interest?
No,
I don't think I was surprised because when I was working on President Obama's campaign in 2007. I'd taken a few trips abroad around that time, and we also had a lot of volunteers on the president's campaign who were not American, and they couldn't vote, but they felt strongly enough about the American election that they decided to come and volunteer. So I think a lot of us know the global impact of an American election. It's just interesting because it's been a while since we've had one, right? So to see how it's covered abroad is interesting.
And so how do you explain the Trump phenomenon? Because the whole world is still trying to understand it and why he's winning, I mean, at least his party's nomination. Why has he done so well? Why did we think 6 months ago he wouldn't make it this far anymore?
I would love to know the answer to that question. I think it's a few things. The way the primary process works, particularly on the Republican side, there were so many candidates, and some of the states are winner take all. So the person who wins the majority, even if it's a very slim majority, wins all of the electoral votes from that particular state. So because of the structure of that and the nature of the candidates, excuse me, that was a slip that's probably pretty accurate though. The nature of the candidates, some of whom happen to be characters, you've gotten in a situation, particularly on the Republican side, where you've got a Trump nomination. But I think what's indicative of that, even on the Republican side, is the majority of people who voted in the primary did not vote for Trump. They voted for other candidates if you take all of that math and add it up. So I think he has a long way to go to really secure his stature within the Republican Party leading up to his convention.
But does it worry you? I mean, you know, your parents were immigrants to the United States, and when you see a man like this with his sort of very out-and-out racism, his anti-Muslim rhetoric, he's anti-everything, I think, anti-women, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant. Does that worry you to see that kind of thought coming into mainstream American politics and being expressed in this way?
Of course. I think, you know, my explanation of the math is totally divorced from, I think, my feelings and the feelings of most people I talk to about a potential Trump candidacy, not to mention presidency. I mean, my experience is that he doesn't represent the majority of Americans. I think, you know, America is a melting pot. It prides itself on welcoming immigrants. Immigrants do extremely well in the United States. Unlike a lot of our friends in Europe and other places around the world, you know, we've had a long history of welcoming people of all different faiths. It's one of the reasons that America kind of gets along with other folks so well. One of our strongest assets happen to be the Muslim American community. You don't see some of the challenges that you're seeing in places like the UK or Belgium, precisely because we're so welcoming and integrative. I think, unfortunately, you know, what Mr. Trump has been doing is spewing a rhetoric of fear to try and wrangle up votes from folks who had not necessarily voted in the past. And that's something I can relate to a little bit in terms of the outreach, because that's something that President Obama did so well, in the sense that he reached out to first-time voters, people who had never voted before or felt disillusioned in the process. So unfortunately, the folks who Mr. Trump is reaching out to, who were probably disillusioned or felt disillusioned before, he's unfortunately reaching out to them with a rhetoric that's very hateful and I think not really representative of what most of us have experienced in America.
it's interesting that you've been very supportive of Bernie Sanders and his campaign. And I think one of the interesting quotes I saw from one of Bernie's campaign meetings was where you said, the media has been criticizing Senator Sanders for being unrealistic, for promising too much, but you believe that these are all good qualities and that in America we should aim to think big. That's interesting.
Well, we've had a long history of that, right? If you think about all of the amazing things that people do, and this is probably a global phenomenon, not just an American one, but you have to aim high in order to achieve anything, really. So in the case of the current presidential election, one of the things that I love about Senator Sanders is he's making all of these big ideas or promises, and I think, I'm a pragmatist. I understand that of all the campaign promises that everybody makes, you don't necessarily achieve all of them, but I think if you don't aim for 100%, you're never going to achieve even the 50 or 40%.
Even if it sounds unrealistic?
Well, I think what's unrealistic, right? It would be unrealistic to go to the moon or to fly in a plane, but we managed to do it. So I think that the notion of what's unrealistic is different than what's pragmatic. I think you've got to aim high in order to achieve something, and so that level of unrealism in a primary process, I think, is a little overstated, and that's I think what I was referring to there, where you've got particularly a lot of the political press there who's saying, look, this is a done deal, and certainly the math does favor Secretary Clinton, who I also think is a fantastic candidate. But what I was referring to there was, let's dream high, let's aim big. That's something that President Obama has done to some great results. He, of course, has not achieved everything that he set out to. He's the first one to tell you that, but that's the nature of politics. In 4 or 8 years, you're never going to get 100% of the things you want.
He surprised people with his performance as well. I don't think people expected Bernie Sanders.
Senator Sanders? Yeah, no, he's...
People are surprised. And the way he's connected among young voters, what do you think explains that?
Yeah, young voters in particular. I think they've grown up in a time where now, especially after the last 8 years, things like doubling the Pell Grant, which is a grant for college education in the U.S. that the president was able to double, standing up for things like marriage equality, LGBT and women's issues. These are all things that now, if you're 18 years old, if you're a first-time voter, for the last 8 years, since you were 10 years old, these were all normal things. These were things that are wholly American. And so I think they see somebody like Senator Sanders as expanding on all of that progress, rather than someone who's just going to hold the line or regress on those. That's why I think he's done so well. I think, unfortunately, Secretary Clinton has not done as well with young voters if she becomes the nominee, which it looks increasingly like she may. I hope she does better with young voters, because I think their politics align much more with the Democratic Party than with Trump.
Well, tell me what you think of her, because it's interesting that in this particular election, when you look at the sort of poll numbers for Donald Trump and for Hillary Clinton, there's a very high negative factor that many polls have shown about both of them. Polls have shown a lot of people don't trust Hillary Clinton. Young voters, as you said, are connecting more with Bernie Sanders than with her. Does it worry you that there is this very high negative factor amongst both the leading candidates, and about her in particular? I
don't think it's ever a good thing to have to vote based on negativity or the concept of a lesser of two evils. So I think that's worrisome wherever you are in the world. You ideally want choices that everybody's excited about. But I also think some of that comes with the territory of having a long political career. You're never going to agree with 100% of the things that any politician is doing or saying. And that's just the reality of how a democracy works. It's a good thing that we don't have a monarchy and, you just have to listen to what the person says. But I think the byproduct of that is you're not necessarily always excited about every candidate the same way. So, an Obama presidency, incredibly exciting for a number of reasons. He was also relatively young and new on the scene. That's not going to be the case most of the time. But I do think Secretary Clinton's got a tremendous record. My biggest issue and why I chose to support Senator Sanders in a primary was the same reason I initially decided to support Senator Obama. He was against the Iraq War, and he wasn't taking money from federal lobbyists. So that's something that Secretary Clinton has decided to do, which is a totally fair decision on her part. In a primary, I thought that it would be nice to extend the progress that President Obama's made. But these are only two of a whole number of issues, right? And as Secretary of State, Secretary Clinton did a tremendous job, I think, was very much in line.
And she's dealt with a whole range of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
let's talk about President Obama.
Sure.
Because, you worked for him, and you just had the chance to go to Cuba, which sounds absolutely awesome.
It was awesome.
Tell us about that, and that's thanks to him. His approval ratings today are the highest. He made a joke about that. He hadn't been this high since he was looking for a major in college. But why do you think he's suddenly so popular? And do you think it's because he's had this sort of groundbreaking work that he's done vis-a-vis Cuba, Iran, the job growth has been pretty good in the US for a couple of years now. What do you think explains his popularity right now?
I think it's probably a few things. I mean, he has never given up on the promises that he made. So if you look at things that have taken a very long time to get done, for example, Guantanamo or normalizing relations with Cuba, as you mentioned, those were campaign promises a very long time ago, more than 8 years ago. And they're slowly coming to fruition in a way that needs to happen at a particular pace. I think he wishes Guantanamo was done way quicker. Unfortunately, because of the U.S. Congress, it hasn't happened. But if you take the example of Cuba, the majority of Americans, I think, want normalized relations with Cuba. Clearly, 50 years of an embargo hasn't worked for whatever our goals were. And having the chance to go up as part of an arts delegation 2 weeks after President Obama and President Castro met in Havana was tremendous. This was the first time that American artists had a chance to go on an official U.S. government delegation to meet Cuban artists in history.
It's been amazing.
And it was incredible because Cuba has such a long history of art and music and culture, and it's been ingrained into the way that the education system works there. And that was tremendous to see. We brought Dave Matthews with us on the delegation along with Usher. There's a Cuban musician named Carlos Valera who played with Dave Matthews a couple of nights in a row. They wrote a song together. They'd never met before. Dave hadn't been to Cuba. Carlos, I think, had been to the U.S., but they didn't know each other. So things like that I think are a people-to-people, diplomatic connection outside of whatever politicians are doing. Certainly, even outside of business ties, is important because they're 90 miles away from the U.S. And there's no reason why we shouldn't get along and continue to build these partnerships.
I know, it was the first presidential visit in 88, 90 years. So
yeah, exactly.
That's a pretty long time. I'm sure you've been asked this question many times, but what made you give up or at least temporarily suspend your acting career to actually, do public service? That's pretty brave to do that.
Thank you. I mean, I don't see it as brave. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of people do this. So in the U.S., every 4 or 8 years, there are a lot of people who are political appointees in different administrations, and they come from the private sector. So, doctors, engineers, certainly college professors who are experts in particular fields will take a leave of absence for a year or 4 years or 8 years. Serve their country.
It's not that easy to
do
it when you're an actor.
Well, I think it's a little different, just because things align a little bit less with some of the work in government. So there's no kind of movie expert job in the White House, which is probably a good thing. So in graduate school, I studied international security, and it was always something I was interested in. I didn't see myself working for a political campaign, but in 2007, all of the screenwriters went on strike in Hollywood, and I was on a show called House at the time, and we couldn't shoot any more episodes. I had read 2 of the president's books at the time, and he was coming to speak in Los Angeles, and had the chance to see him, and signed up to volunteer for his campaign, and thought, I really liked all of his stances on the Iraq War and college affordability, Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, marriage equality, all of these things that he either had been actively talking about or had talked about in the past. And I signed up to volunteer for him, and the next thing you know, about a year and a half goes by, and he becomes the president-elect, and there was an opportunity to serve in the White House, and I couldn't come up with an answer bigger than, I'm sorry, sir, I have another stoner movie to make. So I figured I should probably say yes and serve my country, yes. And it was supposed to be for a year. After working for a year as his liaison to Young Americans, you realize government works very slowly. Many times that's on purpose for checks and balances. But a lot of the things that I wanted to see accomplished while I was there were going to take another year. So I stayed for about 2.5 years.
One final question. We have our Prime Minister in India who's, of course, a Gujarati as you are. And he's made quite an impact, around the world, and especially with the United States. He's heading there for yet another visit in a couple of weeks. What are your impressions of Prime Minister Modi?
I've only met him once, but there's an incredible amount of excitement. I had the chance to accompany President Obama in January of last year when he was here for Republic Day, which is an incredibly historic trip. Took a selfie with Prime Minister Modi very briefly. I heard that was the thing to do as an actor.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to see the excitement. I think I tend to be certainly much more progressive politically, but seeing how 2 world leaders whose politics might be completely different can get along, particularly when the countries are friends, when there are issues of national security and environmental protection and things that the shared values between the United States and India, to see 2 leaders, particularly at a time when they're both either popular or on the rise or have the backing of a lot of people. it's an incredible opportunity, regardless of how you feel about politics in either country, frankly, because that's sort of what it means to have a partnership among two countries. Now, I'm heavily biased, right? I'm an American, born and raised, and to have the chance to visit a country with our president, where my parents are from, is a huge historic thing. And then to add to that the fact that as an actor, I took a little break, but now I'm back to acting. To see that there's so much love for what we do in India, I'm incredibly indebted to our fans here, both on the artistic side and then on the political side, just to see how folks who are working in and out of government are supporting things, like conversations about women's equality and particularly violence against women in India, which we've unfortunately witnessed. A lot of the environmental cooperations, we had the chance to visit some energy sector sites and cleanup sites and toilet facilities and all of those things that are partnerships and have been for a while, but there seems to be a reinvigoration because of the friendship between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. So it's exciting, I think.
Well, Kalpen, it was wonderful to talk to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.